Welcome to Orthodox Journey, a digital missionary activity of the Greek Orthodox Christian Society in Sydney, Australia. Today in our series Journey to Pascha, we will be interviewing Very Reverend Fr Anastasios Bozikis about the Annunciation of the Theotokos and the Greek War of Independence, both of which are celebrated on the 25th of March. Father Anastasios is the parish priest of St Nektarios Greek Orthodox Church in Wollongong, New South Wales, and an associate lecturer in church history at St Andrew's Greek Orthodox Theological College in Sydney, Australia. Father, thank you very much for joining us today.
Good evening, Pandeli. It's great to be with you.
Thank you. As mentioned before, we'll be discussing the great feast of our church, and that is the Annunciation of the Theotokos and the beginning of the Greek War of Independence. This year, we'll be celebrating 200 years from the beginning of the War of Independence in 1821, and our Archdiocese here in Australia has organised several events around Australia to commemorate the event. But Father, we'll first start off talking about the Feast of the Annunciation. Orthodox Christians around the world love and have a special kind of reverence towards Panagia, the Virgin Mary. In Greece alone, there are thousands of churches and icons in her name. So let's start off our conversation with this question. What is the significance of the Annunciation of the Theotokos to us as Orthodox Christians?
Pandeli, I would perhaps just slightly amend the question itself and ask, what is the significance of the Annunciation or the Evangelismos to humanity? Because as Orthodox Christians, with the Annunciation, as with the other great feasts of the Church, while it matters that you believe in it as an event, it goes beyond even our belief. The Annunciation, or the Evangelismos, and I prefer the Greek word because it actually means the announcement of the good news, the Evangelion. And the Evangelismos of the Theotokos is actually the announcement of the good news, not only to her, but to all of humanity. And I think the apolitikio of the feast, the hymn that characterizes this feast, summarizes it very well. Today is the beginning of our salvation, the revelation of the eternal mystery. The Son of God becomes the Son of the Virgin, as Gabriel announces the coming of grace. Together with him let us cry to the Theotokos, rejoice, O full of grace, the Lord is with you. God did not leave humanity to our own devices. We rebelled, we fell, we went our own way, we got lost in the mire of sin and corruption, and yet the good news which is announced to us on the 25th of March is that God has not left us alone. God is coming to be with us. That was the news that the angel Gabriel gave to Panagia, that she was going to become the mother of the God-man. And so it's good news not just for Orthodox Christians, it's good news for the world. As Orthodox Christians, we have the responsibility to live this truth and to communicate it to the world at large. Panagia, as you mentioned, is a much loved figure. And she is loved, I think, because of the response that she gave on that day of the Evangelismos. The angel comes to her, approaches her, gives her this message, and awaits a response. And she stands there for the whole human race. She's our representative before God at that moment. Will you, the human race, receive the gift that I am about to give you? Will you accept my Son in your midst? Will you take the gift of salvation that I am offering you? And on our behalf, she says, Behold, I am the handmaid of the Lord. Let it be to me according to your word. That phrase, let it be, in Latin it's called the fiat. It is God uses those words when he creates the world. Let there be light, yes. And there was light. Let the waters separate, and the waters separated, and so forth through the first week of creation. And now we come to the point where the let it be is not said by God, but it's said by the Virgin. And when she says it, God becomes man. And we cannot but just stand in awe of that mystery, because it is the mystery of our salvation. It's the unfolding of God's plan for humanity, God's plan of salvation. And for us as Orthodox Christians who claim this sensitivity to Panagia, to her response, we need to make her response our response, and share this universal message with all those who are willing to hear it, and all those who are willing to say along with Panagia, let it be so.
Thank you very much, Father. That was a beautiful response, and thank you for also correcting me. Of course, this event is for all of humanity, and I loved the way that you mentioned the Greek word evangelismos and the richness. Perhaps that doesn't come across in the English good news, but evangelismos is Theotokos, and that richness of that Greek, and also the response of Panagia where you mentioned that she spoke for all of humanity. I think that's a very, very important point. Now, Father, thank you for answering our first question. Let's change the focus of our topic a little bit and point out, and obviously our viewers probably know this, but the Greek revolutionaries decided to begin the War of Independence on March 25th, and that's the same day as we celebrate the Annunciation, or Evangelismos. Why do you think, Father, that the Greek revolutionaries decided to start this war from the Ottoman Empire on this specific day?
So when you ask a historian a question like that, you're not going to get a straightforward answer.
Oh.
All right, but let's, if I can just take a step back.
Yes.
Why start the war at all? Why start the War of Independence at all? And I think perhaps we need to, we can establish some context for this, and remind ourselves that in 1453, the Ottoman Turks conquered Constantinople. And it was basically the last city standing. The Balkans and the rest of Greece, with just some small areas of the Peloponnese, had already been conquered by the Turks, even up to 80 or 90 years before that. So it was 400 to 450 years of subjugation, basically slavery. And while the Ottoman Empire did offer certain freedoms, including certain religious freedoms, and in some respects they were a little even more liberal than some parts of feudal Europe at the time, certainly the Christian populations of the empire lived in a state of degradation and humiliation for most of that time. The life of every Christian, from patriarch to fanariot, the upper classes of Greek upper classes of Constantinople, to the Greek princes of Wallachia and Moldavia in Romania, who were going to play a major part in the revolution itself. You may have had privileges as being an aristocrat in inverted commas, but you were still subject to the whim of the Sultan and of any Turk that may at times have sought to impose their will on you. So yes, there were some freedoms, and Sultan Mehmed after the conquest of Constantinople, set up a system where he could govern the conquered peoples, and he called this the millet system, so that because the Muslim Turks and the Muslims in general don't draw a distinction between a nation and their religion, they considered all Orthodox Christians to be part of the one nation, the Roman nation, the Rum Millet, and they placed the patriarch, who was the religious leader, as the civil leader as well, just as the Sultan was the Caliph of the Muslims. Now this did a number of things for our purposes and for the purpose of the War of Independence. It kept the Orthodox Christians together as one community, a religious community, but with national expressions as well. That meant that there was limited assimilation. The only way to leave the Rum Millet and to leave the jurisdiction of the Orthodox Patriarch was to become a Muslim. And this did happen. People did apostatize. They became Muslims, or as the Greeks would say at that time, Tukepsane. They became Turks because they identified becoming Muslim with becoming Turks. So there was a religious consciousness that undergirded the whole Rum Millet system. And that was what bound the Greeks, inverted commas, together, the Romii together, the Romans, which, as they call themselves. Over the next 400 years, there were any number of rebellions against the Ottomans. Kolokotronis would later remind us that the Greeks or the Romans never surrendered. That the emperor fell in battle. No one ever signed a treaty of surrender. The war never finished as far as the revolutionaries were concerned in 1821. And there had been a precedent of 70 rebellions quashed over time. The last one in 1770 under the Russian General Orlov, which failed in Mani and with a large number of casualties. So 400 years of slavery, 400 years of degradation, 400 years of desperation culminated in the early 1800s. 70 rebellions, in a sense, kept alive the spirit of freedom and the possibility of one day becoming a nation again, a free nation. In the early 1800s, we have the establishment of the Philikieteria, the Society of Friends, which begins now, not just within the Ottoman Empire, but in Europe at large and Russia, to gather together the most noted Greek personalities of the time and to bind them together with certain great oaths and secrecy to free the nation. And at the top of this organization were figures like Prince Alexandros Ypsilandis and Count John Kapodistrias, who were serving in very high ranks in the Russian army and in the Russian diplomatic service. So the early 1800s had really brought the point of desperation and an organization now that had begun to be able to give expression to this the desire for freedom. And a number of things happened in the latter part of the second decade of the 1800s, leading to 1821. Have the Napoleonic Wars, which ended in the defeat of Napoleon and in the imposition of the old absolutist order in Europe under the Austrian Foreign Minister Metternich. That caused the great powers to seek to suppress any revolutionary sentiment at all, which was going to be a problem for the Greeks. But you had the Russians and the Russian Tsar Alexander fairly much sympathetic, though he was still playing a diplomatic game across Europe. And that would again affect events. But one thing, I suppose, which did happen in the Ottoman Empire at the time, which no one could foresee really, was that Ali Pasha rebelled against the Sultan. And in 1820, 80,000 Turkish troops had to be diverted from all parts of Greece to Yanina, in order to try and bring Ali Pasha to heel.
Wow.
And that was going to, that created space for other things to happen. And other things did happen. The Theological began to move. Messages were being sent, letters were being sent, but also rumours began to spread as well. And while we're not exactly sure of the dynamics, we understand that the Turks became very suspicious that things were afoot in mainland Greece. And that by the end of November 1820, so suspicious were they that they were beginning to divert troops from fighting Ali Pasha to return back to the Peloponnesos. The Turkish leadership in Tripoli was calling all the Greek notables, including the bishops and the high-ranking Greeks of the Peloponnesos, to come to a meeting in Tripolitsa to declare their loyalty. They knew it was a trap, and they could only stall for so long. And it seems that by February, March, on their way to Tripolitsa, they diverted to Lavra, and there held a meeting and felt that there was no way out of this now. It had to be done. And they declared the War of Independence. And yes, it happened around March 25th. Now, I don't think it was by design, at least not human design. I think,
Yes.
In the end, if it was by design, it was God's providence. And it allowed it gave to the revolutionaries, it gave expression to their religious consciousness and their religious fervour, which undergird everything that they did. So that's probably a long answer to a very short question. But it's what I found very interesting was, because it wasn't just the 25th of March, Pascha was just around the corner.
That's right.
That was April the 10th. So it was very, very close. And it was interesting that once the revolution was declared, once the banner of the revolution had been raised by the Metropolitan of Old Patras, Germanos, and the revolutionaries themselves began to organize into their armed regiments, Kolokotronis tells us that it just spread like a wildfire. He says you could not, in a sense, have organized this. The moment it was declared, revolutions broke out everywhere. Rebellions broke out everywhere across the Peloponnese and Stereolada, even in Macedonia. And he describes it as one rainfall, one downpour came the desire for freedom. Something so spontaneous that it just spread throughout Greece. And the revolutionaries at that time were going around greeting each other before Pascha with Christos Aneste.
Amazing.
It was as if something new now had been given birth, and the keros, the time, had come.
Father, that was an amazing explanation, and thank you very much for going back and giving us some context to your answer. So something connected to 1821, and something that perhaps is not well understood or not widely known, is the specific role of the clergy and the church during the War of Independence. Now, you mentioned before that during the Ottoman, the 400 years of their reign, the patriarch and church leaders were seen as ethnic leaders as well, which is very significant, as you mentioned before. But there are also countless neo-martyrs in our church that are commemorated, which were tortured and killed during the 400 years of Turkish occupation. But the actual struggle for freedom, how did the church, how did the clergy, the bishops, the patriarch, how did they contribute? What was the influence or role of the church and clergy during the Greek War of Independence?
As you know, Pandili, that's very much a contested historical issue, and certainly in our sort of very secular, postmodern age, you have many historians, both in Greece and abroad, who would question the church's role. But I think a fair-minded survey of the literature, of the writings of the revolutionaries themselves, has to allow us to concede to the Church a very significant role in the revolution itself. So, as you mentioned, the Patriarch was considered the Yenarchis or the Ethnarchis, the leader of the nation as well as the leader of the Church. And in the absence of the Byzantine Emperor, now after 1453, in some ways what was left of that role was merged with that of the Patriarch. So the Patriarch and the bishops in general would take on the imperial garments, or the sako, the mitre, in a sense taking these on and protecting and preserving them until such time as they would hand them back, to the emperor, to the king, to the Vasilevs, when he returned. The first patriarch after the Ottoman conquest was Gennadios Scholarios, who was personally appointed by Mehmet, and he was an exceptional candidate for the role. And perhaps this is just as an aside, but when we speak of God's providence, we may sometimes even note that the role of the Ottoman Turks in God's providence as well. We have to remind ourselves that when Constantinople fell on May the 29th, 1453, the Orthodox Church had entered into a false union with the Roman Catholic Church at the time. It was a uniate church, and for political purposes, the emperors thought that it was necessary to subjugate the Orthodox Church to the Pope in order to receive military and diplomatic assistance from the West. This was reversed by Mehmet, obviously, afterwards for his own political reasons. But Gennadios Scholarios was one of the defenders of orthodoxy, and under his reign and that of his successors, orthodoxy maintained its identity and the purity of its faith, even in the dark times of the Ottoman occupation. We missed the worst of the Reformation. We missed the worst of the Enlightenment as well.
Yes.
And so, we can't say what God does or how He acts necessarily, but perhaps there was a reason for these things to have happened as well. But certainly, as I mentioned before, there were any number of rebellions against the Ottomans, and many of them were led by bishops and archbishops who paid with their life. The church was the comfort of the people. It was there that any sense of humanity and personhood was preserved before God. In the church, you were not a slave anymore. You were not chattel. You were not a raya. You weren't cattle. You were a human being before God. And even in just preserving the dignity of the human being as made in the image of God, the church served those 400 years in a remarkable way. The people themselves were deeply religious and deeply devoted to their Orthodox faith, as were the revolutionaries. You mentioned the neo-martyrs, and as we said before we started, that's a talk in itself, the neo-martyrs, and their witness to Christ. And I think the neo-martyrs, they're on a register, up there, okay? So when we're talking about the revolutionaries, we're not, neo-martyrs, they followed Christ's commands to the letter, turn the other cheek, to bear witness unto death. And that's what they did, bearing witness to Christ unto death. But for most of the people, and even most of the clergy, I imagine, operating at that register is very difficult. We're not all saints.
Yes.
We are not all made of that kind of stuff. And it was a very natural pathos or desire of a people to be free. And the church and the clergy who came from the people, were part of the people, certainly carried those aspirations with them. The revolution itself, began, as we mentioned before, under the banner of the cross. The first Greek flag, and today it's a different form of it, but was the cross itself,
Yes.
the white cross on on the blue. Well, it was a blue on white, and then white on blue background. When Kolokotronis led his soldiers into battle, he led them, as he told school children later on in the 1830s, after the war was ended. He said to them, to the school children, "You must keep your faith and reinforce it, because we took up arms first," we said, "for faith, and then for the homeland." Υπερ πίστεως και πατρίδος. So, to preserve their faith, to preserve their right to believe, their right to act out their faith, that was the first task of the revolutionaries. And in that task, the clergy, the monasteries, and the monks, and then certainly played a part. And many monasteries were used as bastions; they were used as fortresses. As you know, the wealth of the church was placed at the disposal of the fledgling Greek state to conduct the war, and many significant ecclesiastical personalities took part. I mean, you have someone like the Metropolitan of Old Patras, Germanos, who raised the banner of the revolution and blessed. But in every town and every village where rebellion broke out, they would begin with a doxology. They would begin with a blessing. In one of the first battles that Kolokotronis won in Valtetsti in May 1821, immediately after he defeated the Turks for the first time, he called a day of fasting. The whole army fasted for a whole day afterwards to thank God for the victory. So there was this spiritual sense that undergirded their actions. And of course you had some clergy who took an active part in the fighting itself. Someone like Athanasios the deacon, who died very early on, who was defeated, fighting heroically very near Thermopylae, where Leonidas and 300 had fought so many centuries beforehand. Defeated, he was tortured, he was impaled and roasted alive, we are told. It's interesting though that the clergy that fought understood that what they were doing was, well, it was something less than what Christ had commanded. They knew that they could not go back to being a priest afterwards. So they would hang up their petrachili, so to speak, to engage in fighting, knowing that this is what they had to do, but it was not the perfect way. And in the Eastern Church, in the Orthodox Church, we've never had any notion of a just war or a holy war, a jihad. In the East, we've understood that war is always bad, but sometimes it is the lesser of two evils. And in this case, the revolutionaries and the Greek people at the time felt that it was the lesser of the two evils. Things were so bad that something now had to change, and this was the only human way of going about it. The figure of the patriarch, Gregory V, I suppose, stands as a point of contention, even in recent debates in Greece. Gregory V, as patriarch, had responsibility not just for the Greeks in Greece, but for the Christian populations, the Orthodox Christian populations scattered throughout the Ottoman Empire, including in Asia Minor, in Cappadocia, in the Middle East, in the Caucasus. He had to look after everyone. And when the revolution broke out in Greece, and we're not sure exactly what part he played, he may have even played a part in that, but the Sultan moved immediately to slaughter, to massacre the Christian populations throughout the empire. And he knew that, and that was one of the reasons why the patriarchate was always so cautious in its dealings with the government, and in its often lack of support for revolutionary movements because of the consequences that would be felt. The Sultan, on finding out about the revolution, so we're talking about March the 25th, 1821, within a few days Constantinople had been informed, and the Patriarch was put in a position where he had to condemn the revolutionaries, especially Alexandros Ypsilantis, who had actually started the revolution in modern-day Romania in February, condemn him and excommunicate him and all the revolutionaries. And yet, while we, as later on, as in hindsight, may sort of look at that a little, suspiciously, at the time the revolutionaries knew exactly what he was doing.
Yes.
They had lived under the Turks for a long time, and they knew the things that had to be said and done. Alexandros Ypsilantis himself understood this meant nothing, and told his soldiers so, as did the other revolutionaries in Greece. Ironically, the Sultan too understood that it meant nothing, and so he was intent on vengeance. And in one of the ironies of history, he calls the Sheikh al-Islam the highest Muslim cleric of the empire, to come and to issue a fatwa against the Christians of the empire, so that he could begin the mass slaughter of the Christians. The Sheikh was a just man, and he stalled for time for a few days. He consulted with the Patriarch. The Patriarch told him that he was not a revolution across the board. It was just very much geographically limited to the southern part of Greece. Not everyone in the empire, not every Christian in the empire was guilty of this, and that the guilty should not pay, the innocent should not pay the price along with the guilty. And the Sheikh accepted this, and he refused the Sultan the fatwa, which led to his he was then exiled into an island of the Aegean Sea, and on his way he was strangled. So the Patriarch himself would die very soon afterwards. He would be hanged on Pascha outside the doors of the Patriarchate, and left there for 3 days before being handed over to the mobs of Constantinople and thrown into the sea. So ironically, the Greek War of Independence began with both the highest Orthodox Christian cleric and the highest Muslim cleric losing their lives in defense of the innocent. Many Christians in Constantinople and Cyprus, Smyrna, Cappadocia paid with their lives. Many clerics were killed. In Cyprus, most of the bishops were executed because of this. So vengeance was meted out. The clergy paid with their lives. In the first Greek minister of ecclesiastical affairs under the new government in 1832 expressed it in this way. He says, "How many times the Greek clergy displayed heroic Christianity, how many times the venerable shepherds disregarded their own lives and laid them down for the sake of their flock." That was the role of the clergy, to walk with their flock, to fight with their flock sometimes, to die with their flock. And the Patriarch gave the first example of that. He had the opportunity of escaping Constantinople. The diplomatic corps in Constantinople were ready to get him onto a foreign ship and into Russia. He refused to go, and he told his synod not to go either. And he said, "The time has come for I as Patriarch and for you as the synod to pay with our lives, if that is God's will." But he says, and not only was he brave in that sense and courageous, but he was also very politically astute, because he said, "This will be to the benefit of the nation." He says that this will bring the royal courts of Europe, this will get their attention. They will see the plight of the Greeks, of the Christians in the Ottoman Empire, once I am killed. And so, in a sense, he sacrificed himself, that the war would gain the kind of diplomatic traction that ultimately it needed in order to succeed.
As you said before, we could probably have talks upon talks with all these the questions, and definitely your insight as not only a priest but as a church historian. We greatly appreciate that insight, and especially as you mentioned before, perhaps some of these topics are not given justice by other academics and people in more secular circles. So thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and an insight into our church's history and also our nation's history. And us as Greek Orthodox, I believe that we should very much as possible learn this history, and especially now with 200 years after this, the Greek War of Independence, I think there's no better time for us as Greek Orthodox in Australia to learn. And thank you very much, Father, for being part of this journey with us and for educating us as well. And hopefully in the not too far future we can have you as well, and perhaps can have another conversation. So thank you very much once again, Father, for joining us.
Thank you, Brother Lee. It was very enjoyable to engage with you and with your viewers and listeners in such a way. It is an extraordinary, important anniversary, the 200 years. And I think quite apart from the historical aspects to it, which are very interesting to tease out, I think what we need as today in Australia, 200 years later, as Australians of Greek descent, is to find the relevance of that for us today. And I think that then goes back to the 25th of March as the Annunciation, as the Evangelismos, the announcement of freedom for all of humanity, which the Greeks in 1821, in a sense applied to themselves and to their own context, and we have to find how to apply, that universal message of salvation to our own context as well in 2021 in Australia.
Thank you very much, Father.